All right, are we up and rolling? Nikki. All right, Nikki, are you there? Can you confirm that we are live and going? It says yes, we are already. I can hear you. Great. All right, then, guys, let's get this going. I would like to welcome everyone and say thank you for attending. My name is Michael Cravens, and I'm with the Arizona Wildlife Federation. Just briefly, I'm going to pass on giving a big intro on who we are, and just tell you that we are the oldest conservation organization in Arizona. And if you'd like to learn more about us, you can go directly to our website, which we will throw up in the chat, or you're welcome to contact me directly in my email, which we'll put up there as well. So with that, we are very honored and very excited to be presenting to you this today, I should say, Shane Mahoney of Conservation Visions. I am a bit of a fan of Shane's, and I'm very excited about this. So Shane is the president and CEO of Conservation Visions Incorporated, a Newfoundland native. He holds both an honors and a master's of science degree in zoology from Memorial University of Newfoundland. Mahoney has over 30 years experience working primarily as a scientist, wildlife manager, policy innovator, and strategic advisor, but also as a filmmaker, writer, narrator, TV and radio personality, and lecturer, all within the scope of the greater conservation world, encompassing both scientific and professional wildlife communities, as well as NGOs and the hunting and non-hunting public. So with that, Shane is going to talk to us about a host of issues and opportunities we have in the conservation world right now. We are going to have a Q&A. You guys are welcome to plug your questions into the Q&A button down at the bottom of your screen. I'll be watching those, and we will try to get as many as we can answered for you at the end of Shane's talk, but feel free to put those in at any time, and if we have an opportunity to plug them in, we'll plug them in anywhere we can. So with that, I'm going to pass this over to Shane and then say thank you, Shane, for being here, and we are very excited to have you.
Well, thank you very much, Michael, and thanks to all of your staff and colleagues there, and anyone who has decided to give some time out of their life to this particular event. I hope you feel at the end of it that it has been worth your while. Conservation for me, as I'm sure is true for all of you, is something that's much more than just an idea. It is very much a consideration of where we've come from, and it's very much a consideration of where we are headed. And it's also very much a consideration of the wild others who have accompanied us for so long on this same journey, and which hopefully will continue to accompany us as we move forward in time. The natural world is a sacred place, not only because it's irreplaceable, but also because whatever its ultimate derivation was, the natural world is filled, just exploding with color and life and beauty and things of enormous interest. Even things that can be fearful are still extraordinarily interesting to us, whether it is dangerous wildlife perhaps, or whether it is vicious storms that sometimes take place on this planet. And of course, we know that good planets are very hard to find. And so what we do with this planet is critically important. It is critically important in our own daily lives, and it is certainly going to be critically important in the lives of our children, our grandchildren, and all of the other human beings who inhabit this world. There is a great tension, of course, between the demands of human beings and the capacities of this earth, as tremendous as they are. There's a great tension between those demands and those rates of production that have ultimately led to significant losses of nature on this planet. And there is really no region of the world that has truly escaped this phenomenon. Some of these losses have been through natural means, and many of these losses have been mediated or exacerbated, of course, by the demands that human beings have made upon this world, which gave us life, which is the only world that, as far as we know, can sustain our lives, and which is the only world that we can pass on as a wonderful inheritance, obviously, to future generations. We don't have to be in a particular place on this planet anymore to see that changes are occurring around us all the time. There are obviously significant changes taking place in the world's climate, for example, in the diversity of species that exist on the planet, and the natural ecosystems that drive the major cycles of water and wind and soil and so on and so forth, the life-giving forces of the planet. Almost anyone living anywhere is aware of the fact that change has come to their locale. This is true of people who live in Arizona, but it is also true of people who live in India, or people who live in the Maldives, or people who live in northern Canada. It doesn't matter. There is this local change that all of us are aware of. We see it from the days of our childhood to the days of our lives of today. The woodlots that have disappeared, the species that we used to see, the places we used to tramps or fish or picnic or whatever it might be. We've all seen the change. And what's vitally important for us to recognize collectively as humanity and collectively within our own nations is that this change is indeed global. And not only is the change global in its presentation, it is global in the sense of the same drivers that are causing the very rapid ecological change that we see today. Human population numbers, the incredible demands that our wealth allows us to place upon the Earth's resources. And of course, all of these things are contributing to what is widely recognized as a kind of sixth extinction, a massive depletion of the wondrous diversity of all forms of life, from large rare mammals to insects, to birds, to plant life, etc., to the ocean's great mysteries and beyond. We are seeing this global impact. And in a way, that story can be overwhelming. In a way, that story can be depressing. But in a way, too, I think it is a story that we can try to discover in a positive way as a sort of incentive for all of us to recognize our shared humanity, our shared world that we all rely on, and therefore our shared responsibility and our shared needs to address the illnesses that are present on planet Earth today. Obviously, one of the most striking ones of these is the issue of climate. But before I talk too much about that, let me set up one notion that I want you to please hold in mind as I give this brief presentation before we have our questions. We talk a great deal about the diversity that's being lost in terms of species. I would like you to think throughout this presentation and reflect on the enormous cultural diversity of humanity that is being drained and extirpated, diminished every single day on this world that we share. I think this is one of the great calamities of modern time. It's not new, but like many other ecological processes, this is happening at an escalated rate. The issue of climate. It is interesting that there can be so many different perspectives on this issue. While there may in fact be a consensus view among certain groups of people, such as scientific scholars who have studied this process and know the historical data and the historical trends, and to borrow from the latest scientific innovations to build backwards what the climate of the planet has been in the past. While they may hold a particular view that the Earth is warming ever faster, that the calamities that await are of great moment, and that we are already living through a time of escalated costs to humanity of this world heating, if you will, such as through changes in crop distribution and the applicability of soils and crops over the world, the manifestation of superstorms, and the kind of just environmental calamities that are happening to people everywhere, including the depletion of life-sustaining resources such as fresh water, etc. Yet, there can be many people who will take issue with whether the climate is really changing, and who will point to the fact that there have been many perturbations in climate over long periods of both geological and historical time, and that therefore it is somewhat extreme or alarmist to suggest that we are actually involved in a major kind of climate phenomenon or climate crisis at the present time. And then, of course, there is a great deal of debate around if we are seeing a significant change in climate, what is driving that change? Is it primarily exogenous change that is taking place anyway in a kind of cosmic sense? Or is it an endogenous change that is being driven, by the activities of human beings through our industry and our extraction of resources, etc.? But wherever one sits, wherever one fits in this particular table of discussion and debate, I think the overwhelming evidence will be that the climate is changing, and it will bring very serious consequences to the ecology of the planet. And of course, it already has for many of us. We believe this is true. I see the changes in my own home of Newfoundland. We're in the middle of the ocean, and we see these changes. And what we need to understand is that the impacts associated with this changing climate are not reserved for simply all those other species. The human species is no different than any other species. We breathe the air that's required, need fresh water and food and sunlight to even create the vitamins in our bodies that are necessary to ward off infections and illness and so on and so forth. We are an animal in every single sense. And therefore, of course, the climate impacts will visit upon us in both indirect and direct ways. The water reservoirs in the Western United States of America, you all know what they look like. You also know that in your own state, 40% of your water, I think it is 40%, comes from the Colorado River. And of course, many other states are drawing from the same artery of water, and it has a finite capacity to provide. And while some people, again, may dismiss all of this, relevant questions might be asked. Why is it true that today there are actually engineering concepts to bring water from the Great Lakes of Canada to the great fertile grounds of California, which of course produces an enormous percentage of the produce of the United States? We are, in other words, in this climate change world, exploring options and realities that would not even be conceivable if there was not some sort of general idea, consensus, belief, fear that the climate of the world is fundamentally changing. And we don't simply hop in our pod and fly away to some other place where these factors don't play out. Now, I know there's a division around these ideas, and sometimes you can divide that along persons' political viewpoints or where they happen to come from culturally in a particular part of the country or region, or whether they are, people who hunt and fish, or they don't hunt and fish, or they live outdoors or spend time outdoors or do not. I am not interested. I am not interested in the divisions only to find ways of removing them and building consensus. I am not fascinated by divisions. They are a constant in human history. I'm much more fascinated by how we bring people together. And of course, we have lots of things that can bring people together. We have, for example, another major agenda item, I suppose, on the world conservation stage, which is the idea of 30 by 30. The idea of sort of offering greater protections or increased protection to 30% of the world's land and 30% of the world's oceans. This is an idea actually that actually has a strong connection with the state of Arizona, of course, because Greg Asner, who's at Arizona State University, and maybe other colleagues of his, I'm not sure, were part of the leadership and authorship team that actually came up with the independent study that looked at this question. But of course, this is an extraordinary opportunity to actually look at the world today and to find ways of protecting more of it, and using the most important recent information on economic theory, economic parameters and realities to point out that the protection of larger areas of the world is not necessarily associated with great economic hardship, but in fact can be actually associated with economic benefit for people and communities and countries, hemispheres, and for the world over. And fortunately, in Canada and the United States, the two countries that we are perhaps most familiar with, we have relatively few people, and we still have a lot of land, much of it in private ownership in the United States, less of that so in Canada, but nevertheless, the land is there. And the land is critical. The land is crucial. We cannot create any more of it. And what we have, we must make the absolute most of. And I don't just mean by making the most of in terms of taking the most out of it, making it produce the most, but having a worldview that understands the beauty and the value of land, perhaps much in the same way that early settlers did, the same way that indigenous peoples always have, etc. But this issue of developing a campaign for nature that involves 30% of the planet, and that is built in an inclusive way, that has its principles the support for locally led conservation work, that has in its principles working for more equitable and inclusive ways of treating conservation and dealing with conservation, and looking at the world's resources and our use of them in a more inclusive way, of honoring the sovereignty of indigenous peoples, and working very much in support at the same time of private conservation initiatives and local peoples. These are wonderful principles, and they're important, and they can bring us to victory. And so again, just as climate change can be debated and problematic, this 30 by 30 can raise people's concerns about who's taking the land. Is the land being taken from us? Will we be able to use this part of the ocean? Will we not be able to use it? We have to start thinking about this as a global community and as a nation, and understand that what one part shares, every part shares, and what one part loses, every part loses. I look at the United States of America. I've been traveling to your country for many years. I've made many good friends, colleagues there, and I can honestly say that the United States of America has supported my ideas and my work more than any other country, including Canada, which seems a little bit bizarre perhaps, but nevertheless, that is absolutely true. And so many profound things have come out of the United States of America when it comes to conservation. It's something that ought to make every single American proud. If every American citizen could only know it, it could only be told it and exposed to it and understand it. And we've seen so many things. The Migratory Birding Convention Act, which of course was signed with Canada, but which had so much momentum out of the United States. The the North American Waterfowl Management Plan now, where massive amounts of American funding flow into Canada to help with the conservation of breeding circumstances for waterfowl species and so on and so forth. The farm bills that you have generated in your country, which are extraordinary and which not many other places have. Certainly Canada doesn't have anything that's comparable. And now, of course, you have this latest phenomenal outburst of energy and vision with respect to RAWA. Again, nothing comparable in other parts of this hemisphere. Again, led by American thinkers and by Americans at every level, in non-governmental organizations and in industry and in political elites and so on and so forth. And now, of course, a program of massive funding for non-game species and much more diverse programs in your states. This has been reintroduced, of course, to Congress now, but it came out of a blue ribbon panel of individuals like Johnny Morris and people from the Wildlife Management Institute and all of this kind of thing. Again, a phenomenon where a group of people come together and said, we should provide all this money for conservation in America. I mean, this is world leading stuff. And of course, it too always generates its own debates, both within the conservation community or within certain segments of the conservation community. You know, what will this mean for the status quo? What might it mean for hunters and anglers and their particular, you know, kind of elite or high profile role that we have had, because I am one of them, in the decision-making process and influencing policies and so on and so forth, and where the money from the hunting of species has been so vitally important in the funding of state programs. What will happen when suddenly new sources of funding are made available? Will it change the status quo? Will it upset things? Well, of course it will. All change upsets things. That's the beauty of it. But that doesn't mean that people have to lose in that change. It is possible to build mechanisms that advance all causes at the same time. A rising tide floats all boats. And these are the kinds of powerful phenomena that we need to seek in society when we talk about what conservation really means and what conservation should mean to the individual citizen and to people. And of course, you know, there is a changing world, and we have to recognize it. The world that we grew up in is not the same world as today. And the world our parents grew up in is vastly different, and so on back through. So change is everywhere. And of course, for those who are in love with the outdoors, we know that the perceptions of that are changing as well, particularly for people who use natural resources sustainably, particularly living natural resources, hunting, for example, in particular, and angling to some extent. You know, many of these cherished traditions are under pressure from thinking and policies and innovations that are taking place around the world that don't necessarily agree with these activities. We may view these as antagonistic, we may view these as the enemies in some certain cases, but what is really happening here in this debate over animal rights and animal protection and animal welfare and the issue of hunting and harvesting natural resources for sustaining human lives and human health and human livelihoods, which must happen? The debate that is being resurrected and intensified today is not all part of some kind of negative conspiracy. As human beings have moved away from relying on nature directly and harvesting nature directly for themselves, their impressions of things have changed. The individual who lived by raising small numbers of animals that were butchered every fall for the winter's meat, or who spent their time harvesting from the ocean or from the rivers or from the land, and has all of a sudden, generations later, ended up, you know, his family ends up generations later in a circumstance where they no longer have those connections. One of the things that surfaces is the one thing that will never leave us, which is the fascination with animals, the fascination with nature. And so suddenly our view of all that shifts into a much more protectionist view. We think of animals through the eyes of our pets, of our dogs and our cats and our horses and so on and so forth. And there is not a person listening to this, there's not a person I know who does not feel the deep emotional attachment to those animals that share their lives. This is a natural thing. This is a beautiful thing. This is the thing to be encouraged in children all over the world, to be kind to animals, to love animals, and so on and so forth. And you cannot see a growth in this without seeing some aspects of concern and confrontation with the ideas of animal harvest. They must conflict to some extent. And the trick for those of us who are harvesters, those who do fish, those who do hunt, etc., is to find a way to ensure that people understand the respect we have and the fact that animal welfare is very much on our minds, because the animals that live wild and live free and which are then harvested by people often live lives that are far better than some animals that, of course, are raised in captivity. But what we must realize is that the global mind is changing, and we must always be aware that we too are part of that change, and we too must find our lives and accommodate our lives and our traditions and our values within that broader sea of change that is taking place around the world and within our country and within our states and between our cities and our rural peoples, etc., etc. These patterns are not unique to Arizona. They are not unique to the United States. The interesting thing is that these patterns are global, and these patterns are appearing in every part of the world, from China to India to Mozambique. And so we must understand that this is the world in which we live. The idea, however, that is perhaps most important is that we come to recognize that the engagements we have with nature, all of them, whether one is a voyeur, a bird watcher, a canoeist, a kayaker, a rock climber, just a hiker, a cross-country runner, somebody who never harvests anything, or if one is a harvester of plants, a harvester of berries and of fruits, of nuts, of things of this nature, or a harvester of living animal life, of fishes and of birds and of mammals. What we have to understand is that those engagements and those experiences in nature can only be possible if nature is healthy. None of the people I have listed, none of the categories I have listed, have an interest in following their tradition and their pursuit in lands that are depleted, in rivers that are despoiled, in landscapes that are distorted and ruined. They have the greatest interest in pursuing their traditions in nature as they envisage it, wild, healthy, beautiful, and sustaining. So all of us in this sense have the same kind of investment. Now, I have spent a lot of time working on a concept known as the North American model, and I have spent a great deal of time writing about it, speaking about it. As a matter of fact, quite a number of years ago, I led a series of workshops along with some close colleagues of mine in various states. And of course, Arizona was one of the ones where I actually spoke about the North American model to every single staff person in the organization of Arizona Fish and Game. I have spent a lot of time trying to get people to understand that nature and conservation in the widest sense does not happen by accident. Wildlife diversity no longer is an accident on this planet, as it might have been when there was only 100,000 of us. With the billions of us now and the transformations we have made, the future of all wildlife is now in our hands. The future of all beautiful areas is in our hands. The way private land is treated is in our hands. And we can do many different kinds of things. And some of them will be more beneficial for wildlife and for people than will others. The North American model is a phenomenon. I won't spend too much time talking about it because I know you know the basic principles of it. But think about the fact that over 100 years ago, not terribly long after the end of the Civil War and the massive changes that were taking place in the American landscapes west of the Mississippi and so on. I mean, not terribly long after that, both Canada and the United States joined forces in a visionary pact as to how to manage the living resources of both countries, but also about ideas like national parks and wilderness areas and all manners of conservation that did not always involve the extraction of wildlife or fish from the landscapes, but afforded a diverse range of possibilities for people, even that far back. And two independent nations, completely sovereign nations, agreed that long ago to form basically shared institutions and policies and laws to ensure not only that migratory species could face a safe future in both countries, as they must to survive, but which also allowed us to understand and learn from one another about the best ways to manage wildlife and to provide access to people to wildlife and to still conserve it. And to have created a system that took many species that were endangered at the time, mule deer, white-tailed deer, black bear, Canada geese, elk, go on with this massive list, and recovered them in a way that did not mean isolating people from them, but through regulated management approaches that included protected areas and included preservationist ideas, that we could actually have human beings continue in all the dimensions of their outdoor traditions with nature. This is an absolute act of genius. There is no other way to describe what that group of people and the many individuals who influenced that thinking actually created out of the turmoil and depletion that was taking place in the North American continent at that time. This North American model is the pride and often the holy grail that is held up, of course, by the consumptive community, the hunters and anglers. They have every right to be proud of what they have done, but the model is not fixed in stone, and the model should not be interpreted as the 10 Commandments. We must recognize that there were things we could have done better, and there were things that we might do better yet again as we move forward with the model. And one of those things, for certain, is to find a way to be more inclusive with respect to all citizens in our countries and involving them in some kind of equitable way in this conservation equation, which, when we solve it beneficially, of course, benefits every single one of us. One of the things that experience with the North American model led me to, one of the experiences that forced me to think a little more about all of this, but which was also influenced by the challenges we face, the climate change issues, the depletion of species, the loss of grasslands, the loss of other biomes, the challenges we face in our coastal regions of the southern and southeastern United States, for example, and in parts of the western United States, and of course in other parts of Canada. You know, part of what the thinking of the model and the thinking about all those issues led me to was a realization that we could decomplexify a lot of what we talk about in conservation and hopefully bring people together by making certain overview assessments. So I posed the question to myself and to many others: what are the problems we face in conservation? And this normally unfolds, you know, one of those magic lists like you see in a cartoon where somebody just keeps unrolling the list and unrolling the list and unrolling the list. So it's so long that, you know, eventually you can't see the person who's unrolling it because they're buried in paper. But ultimately, I think we can boil all that down and we can come up with 3 challenges for conservation. Only 3. The first one, which is the most important, critical one, is that too few people care. Too few people care anywhere and everywhere. Secondly, that those who do care, and thank God we have the ones who care, ones here today, that the people who do care are often very much divided. And as a result of that, whatever good energy and intentions and hopes and aspirations we have, to some extent they are shaved off by the friction that occurs within the group who cares. And of course, the third problem we have is we don't have enough money. But the only reason we don't have enough money for conservation efforts is because not enough people care. And those who do care are divided. And therefore, they speak to the people who would provide funding with different tongues. And that leads to a loss of momentum for finding the resources that we need for nature. The amount of money needed globally to address the vast majority of conservation concerns in this world is absolutely tiny. It is so small in comparison with global GDP. In some cases, it's small compared with the fortunes of some individuals who now live on this planet. It is not that there isn't money out there. It is that too few people care, and those who do care are divided, and therefore we cannot get the money to be applied to conservation. The fourth problem that I might add is that some people believe that doing things for nature means interfering with good lives for people, when the absolute truth of the matter is that doing good things for nature means better lives for all of us. I have no desire to live in a world without wild things. I am incredibly grateful to every private landowner in every place on this planet who has ever done a single good thing for land that they own, whether it's planting a rose garden or planting trees or doing something for their soil so that earthworms can live happily there and hum along, creating their castings and enriching the planet in their own little way. And for the people who have had the foresight to set aside the magnificent historic national places that should never be changed, should be left forever. And also to the people who have learned how to so effectively manage wildlife populations and conduct the science and research necessary to unlock the secrets of interrelationships in nature that allow us to apply effective management practices to safeguard nature and to safeguard human traditions within it. We have had lots of failures over the world. We have oftentimes eliminated almost entire biotas from parts of the world, particularly in island circumstances. But we have also made extraordinary strides for nature. And in the end, it will only be possible to save what we want and care for in nature if we work together on this, man and woman, adult and child, black and brown and white and green and pink and purple. Only if we recognize that the knowledge and histories of indigenous peoples, that the lifestyles and expertise of rural peoples who have lived close to the land and still do, only if we recognize that all of that together must be brought to bear, can we save and protect the most beautiful place any human being will ever see. No offense to the deeply religious amongst you who believe in different faiths. My religion is Celtic. I believe in the religion of nature and the religion of the land. And I know that I will never see anything more beautiful than what I have encountered on planet Earth. Thank you, and I would love to have some questions from people who have lots of things more important to say than I do.
Wow. Thank you so much, Shane. We covered that. I have I have a paper full of questions here, but I'm gonna try to focus on our attendees' questions. Yeah, you covered a lot of poignant, extremely important topics there, and I thank you for that. So what I'll do is I'll go ahead and jump right into questions we have, and remind everyone else here, try to use the question Q&A chat box you find at the bottom of your screen. Just type your questions in there, and I'll do my best to get them to Shane. So with that said, we have a question here from Lou Carpenter of the National Wildlife Federation. Lou says, it's been an eye-opening year on disease. Can you talk more about the risk from CWD and other diseases, threats to from wildlife?
Yes, I can. I spent a lot of this year dealing with issues primarily that were focused on COVID, of course. And it's been a really eye-opening experience as to what happens when animal transmitted diseases or zoonotics, come close to home. First of all, we have to understand that we live in a world where we are connected with all living things. And our physiologies, our makeups, enable us to share an enormous range of things with the wild others of this planet, all others on this planet. We can understand their behaviors. We can see ourselves in them. We can see them in ourselves. And of course, what it also means, we can consume them, and our bodies are able to do so. And so one of the other things that means, of course, or carries with it, is the fact that we can share the pathogens that they have. Their pathogens can come to us, and as we know, in cases, our pathogens can come to them. As we have explored and exposed more of the world and pushed through our sheer numbers into the further and further reaches and recesses of the deepest parts of nature that are remaining on the planet, it is inevitable, and was inevitable, has been inevitable, and will continue to be inevitable, that we will find episodically that there will appear microorganisms in particular that will find a happy home in the human body, and will be absolutely delighted to spend time cavorting and having great fun replicating themselves inside our bodies and testing the immune systems that we have to see whether we are as capable of dealing with them as some of their animal hosts seem to be. Throughout human history, these zoonotics, of course, have created havoc. People think of the bubonic plague, of course, but we currently have a circumstance too that just imagine if we had not, with COVID, been experiencing at a time when our medical research had advanced to such a state of perfection and knowledge and capacity that within a year it could do something that would normally take 10 years, even a few decades ago, and create these vaccines. Think about what the world would look like as though it were all India at the moment. But we were fortunate that COVID came when it did. Fortunate that we had the talent, the science, and ingenuity to deal with it. But still, look at the impacts. The world will never be quite the same. There will be lasting impacts from this pandemic, attitudinally, emotionally, physically for many people. And we will have to live with it now, because it has proven that it can get along quite well inside the human body and replicate and throw out mutations and do all kinds of fancy moves, fancy dances to get to the hoop, you know, and the hoop is, of course, their own survival. Now, we tend to forget because of our medical science, we have a lot of animal diseases. We have a lot of these SARS diseases that have been out there. But we also have, you know, the Lyme diseases. And of course, we have some of these kind of, you know, inexplicable diseases in a sense that arise, like CWD. I mean, at least in the case of the SARS group and the COVIDs and those general viral entities, we can look at them, we can break them down, we can understand their genetic makeup, we can understand where they probably originated from, and in many cases we can go back to the first animal host, whether it's a bat or a pangolin or a sick pig or a bird flu, and you know, from a chicken or whatever it might be. But then we have, of course, this completely unique thing in CWD, these prions, which sort of no one really quite knows, you know, how these strange viral-like entities emerge. But of course, we don't know the entire natural world, do we? We don't know all of it. We're still finding species that we didn't recognize or ever knew about, and they're not all little insects. We're still finding small mammal species and birds that we didn't know existed on the planet, which is extraordinary. It's fantastic. But of course, we have these diseases. And one part of that picture is Malthusian. Now, Malthus told us hundreds of years ago, you cannot expect any animal population to rise indefinitely without consequence. We see this in wildlife management theory all the time. Density dependence, for example, you know, bad things happen when an animal population rises to a certain point. Now, as humans, we've been insulated so much by medicine, by our cleanliness, by our wealth, and so on and so forth. But we are still the same animal as 100,000 years ago. We have not changed one iota in the last 40,000 years. And so we go about our existence with our clothing on. I'm wearing part of a cow here, you know, my leather vest, you know, my shoes, and so on and so forth. We go around with this, but we forget that we are animals. And so these experiences are going to continue. That's not a fatalistic thing. I'm not suggesting, as some epidemiologists are, that, you know, the big one is coming, like the big earthquake off California or something. We don't know enough to know that. I don't see how. I think that's science getting ahead of itself. But the idea that we are going to have continuous exposure to animal viruses, and that we are going to continue to have to battle illnesses that come to us from other creatures on this planet, is inevitable. And in some ways, perhaps if we were gods, we would look at this and kind of say, maybe it's a little bit of fair play, not to make light of this, but you know, you've done so much to this planet. Maybe it's time somebody gave you a little wake-up call and made you realize that you cannot just go in and scoop it all out and take rainforests away with their unbelievable networks of biodiversity that we don't even remotely understand, and then feel that everything is always going to be fine. And at the same time, dismiss the indigenous peoples that have been living there, you know, for, in the case of South America, for example, for maybe 14,000 years, in other parts of the world for as much as 40 or 50,000 years. I think that the whole issue of disease, to me, is a wake-up call in many ways to us, you know. It's a way of saying, you know, you are an animal. And that's what you are. You are an animal. And you are susceptible, like all animals, to disease and to aging and to shared problems, you know, of disease transmission from one to another. And I'm not belittling this, and I'll be very glad to have my vaccination. And I'm very glad that I'm living in the time I am for when COVID happened. As I tell you, if this disease, number one, if this disease had been like AIDS was when it came out of likely green monkeys, you know, with the death rate that was associated with it, but fortunately it was spread through sexual contact, and therefore it wasn't just spread into the air with somebody coughing. If this disease, COVID, had had the lethality associated with the early years of AIDS, just imagine what the world mortality would have been. And nobody knew in the beginning how bad it was going to be or how good. And just imagine if we didn't have the capacity to produce those vaccines, even with it being a somewhat milder, you're not condemned to death if you get COVID. If you got AIDS at one point in time, you were pretty much condemned to death. It's just a matter of how long you waste, how long it took you to waste away, to be terribly blunt about it. But we could have been in a situation in the world today where we could have seen a great deal more death. And I think we have to accept that the reality of zoonotic diseases are an emblem. They are a canary in a way, warning us that we are human, but we are animal. And that what happens on this planet, whether it's disease or flood or climate alterations or loss of biodiversity or an emptying of the oceans as a food source, we will pay a price.
All right, thank you, Shane. Got another question here from Douglas Burt with the Arizona Game and Fish Department. And Douglas says, studies say that a large majority of the public support legal regulated hunting. Knowing that's different from the loving wildlife themselves, what path do you see for increasing the public's passion for investing in wildlife, both in heart, policy, and funding?
Sounds like a great question, but I missed a little part of it. Could you just repeat it for me, Michael, please?
You got it. Studies say that a large majority of the public support legal regulated hunting. Knowing that's different from loving wildlife themselves, what path do you see for increasing the public's passion for investing in wildlife, both in heart, policy, and funding? And I'll add to this, Shane. We've had several questions that are alluding to that connection between, the North American model and the non-consumptive groups, and getting everybody together on that same page.
Yeah. Well, it's a fantastic question, and it's kind of like one of those Russian dolls. There's layers within it. So let me try to not muddy the waters too much. First of all, it has always been to me an extraordinary thing that while we have 4 or 5% of the people in the world, or in our countries at least, Canada and the United States, it's about the same. 4 to 5% of the people, harvest wildlife, actually hunt and kill living things. And on the surface of that, for the 95% who don't, I would have to imagine that some percentage of them think about this and say, why would Shane Mahoney? Why would Michael? Why would Lou? Why would anybody get up of a morning and take their shotgun and kill grouse, or take their rifle and pursue an elk and kill it? I mean, why would they do that? And one of the great surprises to me in researching this question was that I went back to some of the very earliest surveys in the United States of America, where the best surveys are around this issue. And the support for regulated hunting in the country has been incredibly resilient amongst the public mind. I mean, we still have about 80% of the public, as your questioner mentioned, who are in support of regulated, legal, appropriate hunting activity. And I've always wondered why that would be the case, particularly given that we do see a rising empathy for animals in general in a lot of places, including in the United States. There's no question that this is a phenomenon. This is happening. Part of the answer, in my mind, to that reality is that a lot of families and people who may not hunt themselves anymore either currently know somebody who does and they respect those people, they like those people, or they have memories in their family of an uncle or a father or a brother, who's largely men previously, it's not a biased comment, who they loved and respected, who did that. And they may have the mementos of the photos from the family farm, or the shotgun above the, you know, the mantelpiece that belonged to Uncle Jack, or whatever it might be. And I really believe that cultural resonance is still playing out in a lot of ways, particularly in the American mind. It's a beautiful thing. I spoke at Sierra Club one time, and at the board meeting of Sierra Club quite a number of years ago. And some people were very happy to hear me, and some people weren't. And but I had two elderly ladies come up at that time, and very elderly. I would say maybe 90s. I don't know. Um, and um, and they said to me after, you know, we so loved your talk. I thought they were going to come up because I talked a lot about hunting, and I thought they were going to come up and tell me it was time for me to, you know, vacate the room and get lost or something. But anyway, and you know, a 90-year-old woman is a formidable person. You can't, you got to go if they tell you to go somewhere. So, but both of them, these were independent conversations. Both of them told me it made them so happy because they reflected back on a time when they were young children, and they had one lady, they had a farm themselves, and eventually her father took a job in a city. They couldn't make it anymore on the farm. He left and took a job in the city. And in another case, it was a lady who always went to visit the farm of a relative, and they had all these memories of, you know, duck hunting and the dogs and the deer and so on and so forth. So those kinds of things lead me to understand that there can be a lot of support that can last a very long time if the understanding of what hunting and angling is properly portrayed, which obviously they felt their fathers and their uncles and so on did portray it in the appropriate way. Now, we are moving into different waters, and there are contentions over certain types of hunting. You know, whether you should hunt with hounds, whether you should be able to bait, whether you should hunt carnivores, and all these. And they're following a predictable pattern. I don't have time to go into that, but they are following a very predictable pattern. And these challenges will continue. So one of the things that I think holds great promise for trying to build the coalitions that we're talking about is actually around harvesting. I established this Wild Harvest Initiative a number of years ago, in part for the very reason that is being raised in the question that has been posed here. You see, I believe what will unite people around the issues of hunting and non-hunting, and that can really help to build an inclusive community, is to remind all people who spend any time in nature, and I mean any time. It can be a walk in the little park in the middle of your municipality, or it could be a hike to the highest mountain with 65 pounds on your back. The reality that every one of us in that experience is harvesting something. We know what the hunter harvests. We know what the angler harvests. But there is also the berry harvester, and the fruit harvester, and the wild nut harvester, and the wild grasses, and the wild sedges, the wild asparaguses, the medicinal plants, the shed antlers, the firewood, and most important of all, a commodity that no one thinks about as harvested, which is beauty. Every person who spends any time, 1 minute in nature, harvests with their eyes, their nose, their ears, they harvest beauty. And I think that the best place to start for this inclusivity and to encourage a community within a state that will collectively support their state agency, that will collectively provide funding to help support the state agencies, programs, and so on and so forth, is to try to build together a real community of harvesters of all kinds. My Wild Harvest initiative is designed just to do that. An Arizona Fish and Game are a stalwart partner with respect to this. And so they have some idea of what we're trying to do to build this partnership around all of this harvesting. Because nature provides wild food and the experiences of beauty all contribute to our health. One, to our physical health, the second to our emotional health, and really all of them together contribute to the health of us as human beings. So I think if we start to try to think about all of those harvesters, suddenly a particular practice or two starts to become far less significant. Whether you hunt geese with this kind of a shotgun, or whether you use a muzzle loader for hunting deer, or whatever the case might be, I think we build a community around wild gathering and wild foraging. And that means that people of every walk of life, of every nationality, and of every age is part of that community. You can be 90 years old and walk at a slow pace on a nature trail. You can sit on a bench and watch the ocean waves roll towards you. And I really fundamentally believe that the greatest core group that we can assemble are the people who harvest from the natural world. Some do it lethally. Some do it just by gathering berries. Some do it by bringing wildflowers back to their home to put on their table. Some people just come back with their camera loaded up with beautiful shots. And some people just walk back with memories that I guarantee you will never, ever be erased from their minds. And so I think wild harvesting, wild foraging, I think we should have thought about this a long time ago and placed a lot more emphasis on it. And the other thing I would say to the gentleman, I think it's the gentleman who asked the question, I got the name, is this: we're doing surveys now in states just dealing with hunting alone at the present time. We started in Texas, we're running them in Nevada and Wyoming, and we're going to be running them in Arizona. Heidi, I forget Heidi's second name, that's terrible, but Heidi is working with us on that there, along with Ty Gray, and Jim DeVos was working with us as well. But we are going to be running these surveys to look at how much wild food people share. Because here's the thing. Every one of you knows this to be true. I don't know most of you on this call at all, but every one of you know this is true. If you harvest something from the wild, almost as soon as it's in your basket, or almost as soon as you have made that first incision in the animal, you're already thinking about who you're going to share that food with. I'm going to give so much of that to my dad. I'm going to give so much of that to Uncle Jack. I'm going to give these to my grandmother. She's going to make the most fantastic pie of whatever berry there might be. There is something about everything we take from the wild that we have to share. You go home, you immediately tell somebody what you saw in the wild. When you go home to dinner every evening, you don't necessarily relate what you saw on the highway, unless it's a terrible thing like an accident or something. But everything in the wild you have to share: your memories, your vision, the food that you gather. And so you build an inclusive community by sharing with one another. And again, I think this inclusive community is essential, of course. It's not going to be easy to form, but people have to understand that the state agencies are vital, irreplaceable components in the machinery of North American conservation. No one, when I've had debates with them over state agencies, because a lot of people like to complain about state agencies. They don't do enough for me here, they don't do enough for me there, they do too much for the other people over there, and so on and so forth. And I ask them, so what's the alternative to the state agency? Give me your model of something besides a state agency looking after your wildlife resources and the public trust. I don't get any good answers, but I hope I've provided some kind of answer to that question. I hope so.
You did. Thank you, Shane. And out of respect for your time and everyone else's time here, I think we'll entertain one more question if that's okay. And this one is coming directly from our own Scott Garlett, our executive director here at the Arizona Wildlife Federation. And I had it. Now I've lost it. Bear with me. I'm so sorry.
No problem. It's a long life.
All right. Okay. If the biggest challenge is that people don't care, but assuming that most of the people on this call do care, what are 2 or 3 things that each of us can do to help increase awareness, build caring, and unleash passion towards conservation?
There are so many things. There really, truly are. I have a home in a quite a rural part of Newfoundland, where you would think, that everybody was kind of into nature and so on, and they were at one time. But I sometimes witness, because I'm always watching for it, natural phenomena that are occurring, like the big white seabirds, the gannets that dive from up high into the rough water of our oceans to fish. And I notice that some people in my community can be on their evening walk and not even realize that these, hundreds of these giant birds are splashing in at 90 miles an hour into the ocean, sort of all around them. And so I will, of course, point this out to people and say, hey, gee, see the gannets this evening. It's absolutely amazing. And then, of course, the next evening I'll see these people, and of course they stop and they look and they watch this pageant. So sometimes it's as simple as saying to somebody, do you notice what that little squirrel is doing up there? Or have you seen how my dog reacts to that particular raven or crow? Like, he's a pretty boisterous bird, that guy there, and you really got to watch him, because he'll take the bread off your plate if you're not careful. There is a lot we can do one-on-one to simply encourage people to see the world slightly differently. Secondly, there are ways of bringing the world, the natural world, to people, and wild food is absolutely one of the best of those. To go over to somebody with a bucket of wild berries and say, I picked these today and I just thought you might like some of them, and if you don't know how to make jam or jellies out of them, boy, I'd be sure glad to help you do it, and so on and so forth. You get that person to the stage where they actually try to make that jam or jelly, you've got somebody now who's going to be interested in going out and picking those berries next year. These are the kinds of things, along with writing articles, writing a letter to your local papers. Local papers are still in existence and they have a lot of appeal for people. Just making a simple statement about how beautiful a country we live in. If you're living in Missoula, Montana, and you can stay in a hotel there and walk 10 paces out of your room and fly fish in a river. I mean, that's not happening in rural India right now. I mean, there are just so many ways that we can explain the simple beauties about nature to anyone. It's funny, we fish for herring here off the rocks, off the beach. They're oily fish. I don't know if you know herring, but anyway, it's a fairly popular fish, and they flop around a little bit. They're not exactly Atlantic salmon for a battle on the end of your line, but there's a little bit of fun with them, and they're very good to eat. And they got great oils. There's one of those oily fishes that we're all supposed to eat 1,000 pounds a day, and then we'll never die. It's one of those fishes. And so what we have seen in the last 4 or 5 years, the largest group of new fishers are Chinese people and Vietnamese people who have moved here for other reasons and have discovered that they can catch these wild fish. And a lot of Newfoundlanders now will give them their catch, because they really love these oily fish. And so we like them too, but we give them to them. This is a way of translating distance. Not everybody has to be a great hunter. Not everybody has to be a world-class kayaker. Not everybody has to be a top-rate rock climber. Not everybody has to be a great photographer. But we can share nature with people and introduce nature to people in so many ways that it's too easy, in fact. Instead of there being impediments to doing these things, I think the only impediment is within each of us. You know, it doesn't have to be a big excursion. It can be just some really simple things. Walking past a lady who's planting her garden, you know, whether it's vegetables or flowers, and saying, you know, I've been noticing that you get way more bees coming to your flowers than I get coming to mine. Sometimes it's a lie. Sometimes I'm getting a lot more bees at my flowers instead of hers. But I will say that kind of thing to them. And then that leads into a discussion. Well, I haven't really noticed those bees. Oh, well, you should notice them. You see that little one there, and you see this different species over here, and so on. And everyone, I'll tell you, I've never met a human being who wasn't fascinated by nature. When I travel the world and I book into a hotel, from the taxi driver who takes me there to the person who gives me my key to the individuals that clean my room, if they find out because they see a book on my table or they talk to me about something that I'm involved with nature, they just can't get enough of you. They want to know about this stuff. So I think I think we have a real chance, particularly in today's world, particularly in a COVID world, in fact. I think we have a real chance in the face of crisis to actually encourage more people to care. Most of the stories of war veterans in any country, when they are writing home or talking to their buddies in the camps at night or in the ditches, the squalor and the wet, the blood, most of what they talked about, you know, was, God, wouldn't it be great to be home now and just taking my dog for a walk up on the hills, or having a chance to sit by that river and just lay out my bobber out there in my cork and just watch it float around. It's a powerful thing. We have the most powerful drug in the world, and we are the cartel. And we need to push this drug on every human being we meet.
I like that. That was a unique way to put that, but you're absolutely accurate. And I said there would be no more questions, but I have one quick one for you myself. And that is, we have a lot of people involved with NGOs within our audience here today. How can we get involved and contribute to the work you do, like the Wild Harvest Initiative?
Well, thank you very much for being kind enough to raise that. The Wild Harvest Initiative is a program, obviously, that's meant to benefit everyone. It's meant to explain the value of wild foods to our communities, to our families, to our countries. It's meant to reinforce in the public mind that land and waters have a critical value for everyone, which is the element of wild, healthy foods that fortunately in our democratic countries, all of us can gain access to in some way. And it's growing at a phenomenal rate. And we have some extraordinary partners in industry, such as, you know, the Bass Pros and Sitkas and Loopholes, et cetera, mystery ranches. We have state agencies in Florida and Texas and Arizona and Wyoming and Nevada and Alaska, and hopefully expanding from there. We have a lot of great NGOs, Sheep Foundation and Safari Club International, Dallas Safari Club, the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation is a major supporter of it. We have a fantastic community, diverse community, and it is growing significantly because people recognize the value in this idea of health, food, human security, and nature security. And we're now having conversations with alternative energy companies and agricultural companies. I had a meeting today with one of the largest fish companies, fisheries companies in Newfoundland and Labrador, wondering about how, you know, they see their fishing, of course, as wild harvesting, which it is. It's commercial harvesting, but it's a wild harvesting. So the way that people can help, organizationally, we are looking for other organizations and businesses and so on to try to help us financially to do more of this work, obviously. But other things that people can do, we like for people to come visit, to find the information that we have available, to distribute that information, and also to spread the word about the Wild Harvest Initiative to more people. I believe that while the North American model concept, however valuable your audience thinks that has been, I believe this Wild Harvest Initiative is even more important than it. And I think the beauty is everyone, the little girl or boy with their first mushrooms in their pack, to the most experienced hunter that's out there, to an angler that can throw 200 yards a line out there and wind it back in. I mean, it's something that everybody can experience. And so I just think if people are in a position, if coalitions can be brought together, if there are independent organizations that can help us to become our partners, we welcome that. But we also just welcome attention on what the Wild Harvest is doing and the spread of that through social media and greater awareness. We started it from nothing. We now have the largest database in the temperate world. And all of this week, with the exception of this time period, I'm involved with the scientific and technical support body for the Convention on Biodiversity. That Convention on Biodiversity is the most important convention in the world for nature, in my view. And they are now already using the results, the reports out of the Wild Harvest Initiative as one of their baselines, one of their baseline documents for how wild foods can be generated from nature for people in modern society. And I have to thank American and Canadian institutions for having set up the systems to gather this data, 50, 60, 70, 80 years ago. So please help if you can at all and reach out to me if you want to discuss that further. And thank you for raising the question, Michael, and thanks to the Arizona Wildlife Federation for arranging all of this and giving me a chance to talk about these ideas and hopefully recruit some new people to this idea that of eating wild and living free. It's important.
That's awesome. Well, let me say thank you to our attendees and direct them to the chat box where we put up your your Conservation Visions website. So if you do want more information about Shane and the Wild Harvest Initiative and other work he does, please go there and throw your support behind this important program. And with that, Shane, man, I wish I had more than just words to express my appreciation for you being here today. And not only that, but for the work that you do, it is vitally important, especially to everyone here, but not just us. Those folks that don't even know it's important to them, it's vitally important to them as well. You're doing very important work and you're doing it well, and having you here has been really special. So thank you very much.
Thank you all very much. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.